Good morning again.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Sarah Gager. I'm the president of Hunt Alternatives Fund, and I've got a joke for you. So the joke is a philanthropist, a nonprofit leader, and a policymaker walk into a bar. Actually, I don't have the joke. I only have the beginning of the joke. So my hope is that by the end of this day, someone will have thought of some great way to finish this joke. Because I know there's a joke in there. And it has to be respectful of all parties involved. Okay? So remember, philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, and policymakers. Students, I know you guys are going to come up with the best thing. We can create another competition involved, all of that. But we need a joke. So you all have seen the headlines. Philanthropy must do more to influence policy. So all of us here are really strong believers that philanthropy really can step up its efforts to produce big changes on pressing issues. We also know that foundation involvement in public policy is really not new. We know that. Throughout the 20th century, foundations have influenced public policy in lots of different ways. We also know that the actions of these foundations, because of the public benefit mission that we have, they intersect really with the efforts of government. So that creates leverage, that also creates attraction, right? So we've seen that. We also know that it makes sense why foundations have an interest in public policy. Although these governments and these foundations are often distinct, and they are distinct, they have many common purposes. And today, the boundaries between are more defined. Foundation resources are certainly more limited than government resources. But we also know, we know this clearly, that not all policy takes place in D.C. We've got more decentralization of policy decision-making, more leverage points, greater opportunities for foundation engagement in public policy. So all of us here are really excited about that aspect and believe really strongly in it. But we just want to take a quick poll of folks out there. So I want you just to raise your hand and assign yourself to one of three categories. The first category is, you know what, I'm really comfortable with this intersection, I'm familiar with it, I'm actually engaging in it. The work that we're doing as a foundation is very much connected, or the public policy work that I'm engaged in, so I know what we're doing, we're connected. The second group is, I'm interested, I'm intrigued, that's why I'm here, and maybe I'm even dabbling. The third group is, this is overwhelming, this is scary, you're pacing the back of the room, and you don't even really want to be here. So, number one, who would put yourself in the category of you're comfortable, you're familiar, you're engaging in some way? What is that, like a quarter maybe? Okay. Now, what about those of you in the second category? You're dabbling, you're intrigued, you're not really fully engaged. Okay. So maybe a little bit more. And what about this third category? Like, you're going to take a bio break soon. No one? Nice. Really? Nice. Great. Okay. So that just gives us a sense of the audience, so that's helpful to hear. So all we really want to do in the next 45 minutes or so is talk about why, from our perspective, we think that we should engage in public policy through philanthropy. And what are the factors critical to a group's decision in engaging? We want to talk about the why, and then we want to talk about the how. So how should we engage? What are some ways of actually doing it? And we'll do that through sharing strategies and stories of our own. So let me just quickly introduce the panelists that we have here. Kelly Bates is Executive Director of Access Strategies Fund. You all have the bios in your program, so you can take a look there. It's definitely worth looking at. These are some pretty spectacular people that we've got here. So Kelly has been deeply involved in grassroots lobbying, community action, coalition building, political education. She's been involved in reforming public housing rent laws. She's overseen funding for voter engagement projects. So she's really figured out how this all fits together over the past 20 years or so. Then we've got Sarah Beaulieu, that I use my German accent to mask her name, who's a senior advisor to Opportunity Nation. And Opportunity Nation is a campaign at Be the Change. So you know that Be the Change really creates national issue-based campaigns by organizing these coalitions. and Opportunity Nation is really looking at enhancing economic mobility, if I understand correctly. So Sarah has also worked at the University of Massachusetts Foundation, and she's known also for her great fundraising skills through Boston College, Brown University, etc. And you can read more about her. And then we've got Keith Mahoney from the Boston Foundation. He's the director of public affairs there. And we all know the Boston Foundation, one of the largest community foundations, one of the nation's oldest community foundations. They've got assets, anyone know? A lot. Like 800 million, right? Okay. So Keith manages all the public and policy activities. He's involved in some of the research reports that the foundation actually commissions that informs and advances policy objectives. He's a perfect fit for the job, clearly, because previously he was also in Mayor Menino's office, intergovernmental relations. He served as legal counsel, legislative director for State Senator Cheryl Jakes. And so it's great to have us all here. And I'm Sarah Gager. I'm the president of Hunt Alternatives Fund, and that is a family foundation here in Cambridge. We also have an office in Washington, D.C., and we're an operating and a grant-making foundation. We've got 5 programs that focus really on social change, and we have this tagline, which is provoking change for good. Okay, so that's provoking change for good, and that's provoking change for good. And so we're very proud of that tagline. And we also have this silly thing that we've written into these positioning statements that we have that say that the change that we desire will likely not be seen in our lifetimes. It is this commitment to what seems to be the impossible. And it's something that we had to actually write down and say, you know what? We're okay with that. We are okay with that. So, we just wanted to start with each of our panelists giving just a quick opening remark around who you are, and not just what's in your bio, but truly who you are and why this is important to you, and how does this connect really with like the soul of your organization when you think about how public policy intersects with philanthropy. So why don't we start with you?
Okay, great. Can everyone hear me okay? Because, you know, Jeff sounded like God out there. And well, first of all, good morning. This is such a great opportunity to be with people who want to embrace this issue or are thinking about this issue. And she asked us to give a little bit of background about ourselves, and I think it's relevant to this conversation. First of all, I believe that all of our interests, many of our interests lie in what happened to our experiences being at home with our families. And I'm just curious, how many of you were topics of politics or policy or social change conversed, discussed, thought about in your home? You know, I think that's really a common thing that bridges all of us together and brings us to this work, is that it was present in our home. So my background, 2 people who were very influential over my life was my grandmother and my father. My grandmother was a really incredible woman who was very involved in policy and politics, and so much so that when 9/11 happened, many of you may remember where you were, what you were doing. I was worried about my family because they're all in New York City, and I'm like, buildings are falling down. So I'm trying to reach them through all the busy signals. And I finally get my grandmother, and I said, you know, are you okay? And she said, I'm fine. And I said, well, you sound nervous. I'm scared. Is everything okay? And she said, I'm fine. I'm just trying to figure out how to get down to the polls. I was like, what are you talking about? She said, well, it's primary day in New York City, and I'm trying to figure out how I get to the polls and if it's open. And I thought, you know, that's just not the orientation that I would expect of someone, you know, in New York City when the whole set of the world seems to be changing. But that was her tradition. I'm African American and Irish, and in the black community, the vote is just such a very powerful thing, and she never took that for granted, even on that day. My father was also one of the first men to work for Planned Parenthood. He was the director of communications for Faye Waddleton, who was one of the first women of color to ever run an organization like that. So I grew up in a home where he talked a lot about policy. But more importantly, I've gotten to see it work, and I think what really hooked me was, I don't know how many of you feel this way, but sometimes you see people experiencing the same issues and the same problems. And sometimes you can deal with one issue at a time. But the thing about policy and social change is when you make the change, it affects thousands of people's lives overnight even. And that transformation to me is worth participating in. It's so efficient, it's so effective, it's fast, and it just creates a tidal wave that brings everybody on the wave with it into the life that they want to have. So my experience was, I was the ripe old age of 26, and I was leading a nonprofit advocacy organization for women. And we were just tired of seeing women, young women, and women of all ages in the workplace being harassed by their bosses, by their coworkers. And this was before sexual harassment even was discussed. No one even, talked about it. It was like you accepted it. You just moved on and hoped that, you weren't going to be affected by it every day. Well, our organization really wanted to take a step forward for women in the workplace, and so we worked really hard to get a policy into our Massachusetts laws so that employers would have policies against sexual harassment. There'd be training and education on the behalf of employers so communities could understand what this issue was and how to treat women with respect, and really all employees. And, it wasn't going anywhere. We were really trying to move the bill, really trying to move the legislation. But, we were talking to so many women who talked about losing their jobs or not being able to walk to the hall to get a cup of coffee because of the experience that they were having, the inappropriate comments. And their lives were falling apart over this. And it was like a quiet issue. Well, it was really incredible when we got all those women together and they came up in a unified front to the State House and really said, this is affecting our lives, it's affecting our pocketbook, and we want change. Well, it was an incredible thing. There was no movement on that bill for years. But what really changed it was these women went to the State House, they told their stories. And if you remember Anita Hill at the time, if you remember Anita Hill, some of you do, she was a woman, an attorney, who talked about the fact that Clarence Thomas, who's now our U.S. Supreme Court Justice, sexually harassed her, and she went before the entire public to tell her story. So at the same time that was happening, our women were telling their story, and the legislature really heard loud and clear what was happening. And overnight, not overnight, but after some years, but overnight really after they heard those stories, we were able to get legislation passed that changed the entire Commonwealth. And now, you probably know this, you can't go into a workforce without getting that policy. People know. Maybe they still engage in it, but they know that they shouldn't get away with harassing anybody on the job. And it was just amazing when we got that victory. I remember looking at all the women at the State House, and we were on the State House steps, and, they just had tears in their eyes, and they felt so vindicated. And their lives multiplied, by 1,000 were affected by that law and by so many women. And when you see that happen and when you're a part of that change, you realize how important policy is. It's like, I don't want to wait to the, I don't want to believe that we can't see change in our lifetime. I'm sorry, I'm not willing to do that. People say the children are our future and we have to do this for our future. No, we have to do this for ourselves now. There's too much at stake, as our keynote speaker talked about. So the fact that you can use policy and change things, and change it pretty quickly. I mean, most laws get passed within 1 to 7 years. Some don't, but a lot do. To me, it's worth it.
Thank you. And, the story of your grandmother is so telling and gives a real sense of your family as well, which is important to what you become, really. So, Sarah, Keith, I'd love for you to talk also a little bit about the soul of who you are and the soul of your organization before we get into other things.
Sure. So I'm Sarah Beaulieu from Opportunity Nation, and I'm going to tell you 3 short stories about sort of my life and who I am, and then talk about how those come together in the work that we do at Opportunity Nation. So when I was a very small kid, I had very bad asthma, and so that meant that I spent a lot of time in hospital emergency rooms. And one of the things that I learned being in hospital emergency rooms is that doctors did not know how to talk to kids. They would just send me off to go get a test. They would take me away from my parents. They would come stick needles in my arm. I thought that this was atrocious and that they really needed to sort of learn how to talk to kids. But I was curious, right? So it was sort of, I could have just ended it there and just been mad at doctors or scared of doctors for the rest of my life. But really sort of what I turned that into was just a curiosity about why was that? So maybe it's because they weren't trained to talk to kids. Maybe it was because they didn't spend a lot of time with kids. And so ultimately sort of where that led me was this career path that I thought I wanted to be a doctor so that I could then sort of be the change that I wanted to see in the world, which ended when I got to 7th grade and had to dissect a frog. So that's sort of story number one. Story number two was related. Because of my asthma, I got sick quite a bit, so I was in elementary school, and I had been out of school for a week. When I came back, my teacher told me that I had something like 472 math problems that I had to do because I had missed them while I was gone. And I, again, sort of just thought this was a complete injustice, that I should have to do 472 math problems just because I had been out sick for a week. And if the purpose of doing these math problems was to demonstrate that I understood the concepts that they had been teaching in class, like that seemed to make sense to me. So I wrote a letter to the principal saying that I thought that it was a sort of deep injustice that I needed to do these math problems. But I didn't stop there, right? So it wasn't just that I didn't want to do these math problems, but it was the sense of like, I shouldn't have to do this, and you should change the rule. So it should just be a representative number of math problems that you could sort of demonstrate that you learned the concepts, but you shouldn't be punished for being sick, okay? I know it gets worse from there. Like, so then the third story is when I was in college. So when I was in college, and I actually just sort of recently shared the story at one of our staff retreats about kind of an example of how I got passionate about organizing. There was a girl who was sexually assaulted at a fraternity party on my campus. And there were a lot of people that were very up in arms, and they were going to organize this candlelight vigil that was going to be outside of the fraternity house, and it was very polarizing and sort of, people, on one side versus the fraternity. And I just thought that this was kind of like ridiculous, and that I knew some of the members of the fraternity. I was pretty sure that none of them wanted anybody to get sexually assaulted, or that they were not committing the sexual assault themselves, and it actually wasn't somebody who was a member of the fraternity who was being accused of it. And so I went to the president of the Greek Council, and I said, look, dude, this candlelight vigil is going to be outside your fraternity house. So my recommendation to you would be that you participate and partner with us on this candlelight vigil, rather than just sit tight and hope it blows over, because it's not going to. And he said, okay. And I said, great, send me all of your fraternity presidents when the candlelight vigil starts. And so when they did, they were all there, and I had prepared these readings for them to read about from this book called Men on Rape, sort of men's experiences of sexual violence and sort of what that meant to them. So why am I telling you all these stories, right? So I'm telling you these stories because what I learned is that there are systems that force people to act in certain ways sometimes, and that rules affect everybody, and that policy is just sort of rules for our community and for our society. And so when I came to be the change, I loved the way that the organization really thought about systems change as the intersection of policy and culture. So you really need to understand both what's the sort of demand for a type of change, but then you also need to be really skilled at creating ways for organizations and individuals to participate in policy change in a way that feels comfortable for them. So you'll hear a little bit more about what we do as an organization, but I think where we come from is that Opportunity Nation cares about the issue of economic opportunity, and we want to look at both policy and culture and how to move that forward.
Good morning. So I'm going to pick up where sort of the opening that Kelly gave on how people start with this at the dinner table. I'm the youngest of 4 boys. My dad was a social worker, my mom was a teacher, and we argued about everything. Politics, TV, sports. I had a brother who was a Reds fan in the 70s. Not good. At this point, 3 of us are attorneys, and 1, the black sheep, is a high school principal. But 2 of us are both working in nonprofits, and it's sort of no one ever plans, or maybe they do. I can't imagine planning a career in philanthropy. It just seems sort of to happen. I also remember where I was on 9/11. I was a student here at Northeastern Law School, but I was skipping classes because I was working on a special election for the Moakley congressional seat. That election happened on 9/11, and I remember going to hours after that, going to the Rotary in Holy Name Church in West Roxbury and doing a standout with signs for that election. And there was nothing more American to do at that point than to assert that this is why we're here, so we can provide choices to affect policies that will direct where we're going, how we're going to spend resources for the next few years. So I just wanted to start with those 2 points. The way I got to the Boston Foundation was through working in government at both the state and city level here in Boston. And Mayor Menino, who is just such a fantastic guy, will always say that government's about helping people. It's not about cutting the deficit. It's not about these small bore concepts. It's about helping people. And to be able to do that through not just direct funding that the Boston Foundation provides to nonprofits to help people in any number of areas, whether it be housing or public safety or education, but to be able to use the influence of the institution to affect larger systems change is something that really drew me to the foundation. And the ability to be able to continue the work that I had been doing at the city level, at the state level, at a larger scale where you can focus more on a few key issues and drive change in that direction from a standpoint of sort of nonpartisan, neutral thought partnership has been an extremely enjoyable experience, and one that I couldn't have anticipated when I was working, first for a publishing company out of college and teaching, and then eventually finding my way to law school. And one thing I will do a plug for Northeastern Law School. It is the most socially conscious law school that I can think of in the country, and it's certainly why I chose to go there, as opposed to some of the other schools in the area. So to be able to sort of harness analytical skills and reasoning and legal thinking with sort of empathy and compassion that you learn from home, with an organization that has the reputation and the standing to really make significant impact, has been very satisfying for me.
Great, thanks. So one thing that we've all touched on a little bit is why to be involved. And so many people say really that engaging in public policy requires a conscious choice. So people often look at a few things. So I can think of a few things. One is look at the mission of the organization to determine if public policy engagement is a reasonable strategy. Does it make sense? The other thing that people often look at is the scale and the scope. So typically foundations or philanthropists with large endowments, national focus, people think, those are the perfect folks to get involved in public policy. Not always the case. We know, like we said earlier, that not all public policy takes place in Washington, D.C., and there's all sorts of impact policy at the state and local level that people really can engage very, very clearly in various stages. A third thing that people look at, I think, is the law. This often makes philanthropists scared. So what can you do? What can't you do? But actually, the law really provides considerable latitude for engagement, and it just clarifies what you can do and what you can't do. And we're not going to talk about that so much today. That's at a session later on in the afternoon, but people certainly do consider it. Another thing that people think about is the philanthropic environment. Like, who else is doing what? Is there a void that you're trying to fill, or are there people already engaged in public policy, advocacy, that you can actually join them? Does it make sense in that area? So I'd love the panelists to talk a little bit more about the why. Why should we engage? What did your organization really go through in thinking about making this conscious choice to focus on the long term?
So I'll start. So about 10, 11 years ago, the Boston Foundation had one communications person who basically kept us out of the paper. Now we have 9 in my department. And that was a very conscious change and a strategy. So at about that time, 10 years ago, the board of directors was looking for a new president and CEO of the foundation. And at this time in Boston, there had been sort of a significant change in civic leadership. A lot of local companies that provided that sort of leadership on the corporate side were being gobbled up in national mergers. So there wasn't the same type of there was something called the Vault. There were some other organizations that sort of helped guide policymakers. And that sort of our board of directors found that lacking. So they went out and they hired someone who had experience doing this at both a national nonprofit and at Harvard University, Paul Grogan. He had also been a member of the Kevin White administration at City Hall. And one of Paul's early hires was my boss, Mary Jo Meisner, who was then a newspaper executive. And the idea was that the Boston Foundation had the standing, even though it was sort of, people knew about it as a sleepy, good organization that provided funding to nonprofits. And the idea was that they could create a space to be a convener around civic issues in the city and the region. And in the past 10 years, I think they've been spectacularly successful in creating that space. And it's been done through a number of ways. We work with researchers to publish timely and important studies on the issues of the day. We provide meeting space. So we'll publish a report, and then we'll have a forum where we bring in some of the experts in the field to talk about it. We provide meeting space to other nonprofits to come and use our facilities to get together, to meet each other, to sort of work together. People often said that Boston lacked a collaborative gene, and we're trying to sort of force that on some organizations through a lot of the work we do. So it was a conscious decision by our board to say, there's a lacking of civic leadership, and we're going to provide it, and we're going to hire the people and provide the capacity to serve that function. So as this goes forward, it started with a few sort of general, not very thorny issues, and the deeper you get into it, the more closely you get to very sensitive issues where people have to choose sides. So at that point, it gets more complicated, it gets more interesting, I think it gets more fun, but it's something that we continue to work on, and I think we've been able to establish a reputation for doing so.
Great. If you could both talk also about the why and the conscious choice that you and your organization really went through.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about that. So with Opportunity Nation being the second campaign of Be the Change, we went into our work knowing that policy was a lever that we cared about. But we also went into our work with this broad idea of thinking about something that was bipartisan, cross-sector, that we could do around increasing economic opportunity. And so the way that we started our work was with a listening tour of about 300 organizations and leaders across the country to learn more about what they felt were the most important levers around economic opportunity. And we met with lots of different kinds of organizations. We met with organizations that were working in early childhood. We met with organizations that were working to reduce violent crime. We met with organizations that were working on some of the issues that Tamara was talking about. My last name is Beaulieu, so earlier today about college access and affordability. And where we landed was that the way that we were thinking about these issues as a country was measuring them with imperfect measures. So we would look at unemployment or we would look at poverty rates, both of which don't really give you the whole story. And so what Opportunity Nation did is that we worked with some social scientists to create what's called the Opportunity Index. And so if you have a mobile device with you right now, feel free to whip it out. It's opportunityindex.org. You can type in your zip code, and it will give you back a score for your county or your state. And what it does is across 16 indicators in education, jobs and local economy, and community health, talks about what are the conditions in which communities create opportunity or don't create opportunity. And so when we developed that tool, we really started learning a lot about what drives that. And so what we found is that there was one indicator in the index that had the biggest impact on opportunity in communities, and that was the percentage of 16 to 24-year-olds who were neither in work nor in school. At the same time, we had been working with a set of scholars from a bipartisan group of think tanks, so the Heritage Foundation, Center for American Progress, and Brookings, and also heard that there was some bipartisan energy around how you connect young adults to education and career pathways. There was also some interest from the private sector. And so where we have landed now is we put together a policy framework that we released at a summit last year that put forward 8 different ideas. Half of them were public policy ideas and half of them were private sector ideas. And then this year what we're working on is turning that framework into a much more concrete tactical advocacy strategy that we will engage our 250 coalition organizations in. So in our coalition, we have organizations that are working across the indicators in the index, but have agreed to come together around this particular policy agenda because of the impact that we believe that it will have on economic opportunity. And we make it easy for nonprofit organizations to get engaged. So sort of like we're doing a ton of the meetings on the Hill, we're putting together the work, we're saying, here, come join this working group, and we will sort of show you the way for how to have these conversations in a bigger way. So it's not we're doing what no single organization would be able to do on their own. We're working on behalf of a set of organizations who have come together around a particular set of issues.
So I didn't get to tell you about where I work, but Access Strategies Fund is incredibly unique in that we're one of the funders, and there are others that we work closely with that really understand and focus on the connections between systemic change and structural change in our democracy, and believe that policy is a way to really improve the conditions over people's lives and really help their lives move forward. You asked about how do you make this decision to focus on policy. Really, again, it goes back to the people. I think what it takes is someone in the organization or people in the organization who say, we have seen this strategy work and it matters and we want to bring it into our philanthropic efforts. Because let's be frank, right? The community who's trying to make change, they're trying to influence policy actors, right? And policymakers and politicians are motivated by who? Constituents and people have money and money, right? And what's interesting about philanthropy is we have money too, but I think what we do really well is we take money, and I hope, and give it to those who don't have resources and amplify their voices to have an impact on actors who typically may not pay attention to them. And so for us it was, what's a way that we can help communities have a greater voice over their lives? And policy was just such a clear example. And it did start with 2 people. The 2 founders of our organization, Maria and Greg Jobin Leeds, very progressive married couple who were public school teachers. And they were teaching in their schools, and they realized that there were complete inequities in who was getting a good education and who wasn't. They were really struck by how girls, and in particular black and brown boys, didn't have the same access to high quality schools, or when they were in the classroom they weren't respected, and it really upset them. And they also saw that parents had the same concerns they did, but they didn't feel like they had a voice. They didn't know how to change all the issues around the classroom, school discipline, and they understood that people needed to be politically active and engaged in order to change those policies. So they did what philanthropists can do and what people with resources can do. They channeled their money toward solving that crisis. And so they started actually several things, but they started 2 foundations. The Schott Foundation for Public Education, which some of you may have heard about, that does great work funding organizations around policy advocacy for change in the education system. They've launched some of the most exciting initiatives around how to improve education, especially for black and brown boys. No one talked about that issue 10 years ago. They started talking about that issue in the public. Then they started my organization, Access Strategies Fund, because they wanted groups to be funded to have political and policy strength and democracy strength to push their issues forward. They knew that they needed both levers working at the same time. So they made that decision, and they really hired community people to run the foundation who understood and worked with those communities to help amplify their voices. So we started doing work around voter engagement because, frankly, 20 years ago, especially in Boston, everyone basically wrote off communities of color and low-income communities. They don't vote, and we don't care. And that was really the message. If they don't vote, we're not going to be responsive, and they don't. So we're going to go to a neighborhood that does vote. We'll go pay attention to them. We'll go to their meetings, and when they call us, we're going to pay attention. Just very simple. People are busy, and politicians just knew where the power base lied, and that's where they spent their time. we knew that was wrong, and we knew that the communities that had needs were not being heard. And so in those early days, we focused on how do we get more people voting and respected by politicians so they could talk about the issues that impacted their community. Working, education, childcare, all the issues that matter to everyday families. So we put a ton of money into investing in communities to actually not just register people to vote, because back in the day that's what people did. Okay, hi, you've come into our organization, here, fill out this paperwork. But really, how do we create a massive infrastructure, like a campaign operation in community nonprofits that do advocacy, to register people to vote, to turn them out, and make sure people show up at their organizations and hear their concerns and activities so they won't be avoided anymore. And that's what we did. And we did that early on by ourselves, and we had some success, and groups were able to build voter power. And all of a sudden, in places around the city of Boston and in Massachusetts, lo and behold, politicians were showing up to community meetings and, oh, what can I do for you, Yvette? You work for that organization that just got 800 voters out to vote in my district. All of a sudden, the climate changed. But we weren't really having large-scale impact. That's when we teamed up with other foundations and funders. We pooled our money together, and we said, we're going to make an impact around voter engagement. I'm going to leave that story for the last question about what happened. But let me just say that the impact just grew exponentially. And part of what I'll talk about later is, you don't have to do this work by yourself, and there's a lot of security in doing it with others. So we really started at that place. We advanced to funding organizations that do community organizing and policy advocacy, all the way to supporting organizations to work and lobby on issues that impact their lives, whether it was on, health care or criminal justice. And we saw a lot of success. We saw these victories, where our communities were coming back and changing the way that the criminal records system works in Massachusetts so that, people could apply for jobs and not just be discarded because they had a small conviction from 15 years ago. We funded organizations along with other funders who changed that policy within 5 years. So now in this economy, they can actually get a job and maybe even keep it. So, we saw that it just worked. And if you're like me, and I'm sure many of you are, and my founders and my board and my staff, we're very impatient around injustice. We want to see things change, and we're very entrepreneurial in that sense, not in the money way of thinking of things, but we wanted to see fast movement. And for us, going in through the levers of policy and voter engagement and democracy, we saw faster gains than we did, in classrooms watching these children fail one by one, or watching these women suffer one by one in the workplace. When we come together, we can see real change. So for us, it's always been very conscious, and when we hire or we bring in board members or volunteers for our grant-making committee, we ask first, do these folks have the values around the belief that social change works? Do they believe in the role of policy? Do they believe in people standing up for themselves? And if they do, then come on in and let's do this together. We actually have consciously not made a choice to invest a lot of our resources in communications, although I love what the Boston Foundation does. We've made a conscious choice to invest our money in the communities to have the voice over their lives, because that is who's really impacted by the policies. We've seen faster change in that way, and we're allies with them. We are standing alongside with them. And I'll talk about this later, but I think the role that we can play as philanthropists, and we're all philanthropists, it doesn't matter if you have $8 million or $10, is to figure out how to use that resource to empower other people to have a voice. And so we just see that it works, and it's just very efficient and expedient. And once you give people the tools to make change over their lives, they're going to use it over and over again in their families, in their communities, up at the State House and beyond. And when that happens, and it happens amongst many people, that's when you see transformational change.
Great, thank you. So we've naturally moved from the why into the how, and I want to stay in the how just a little bit longer and give you each a chance to talk more deeply about one or two projects that you've worked on, to talk a little bit more about the whole spectrum of possible engagement. We've talked about public education, we've talked about awareness, policy analysis, convening you talked about, Keith, coalition building, lobbying, all of those things. So, when I think about the work of Hunt Alternatives Fund, I realize that we do our engagement in public policy in lots of different ways. We have a local arts program that we're wrapping up, and we decided not to, in fact, invest in expertise within our staff to do it. We were focused on getting more private dollars into youth arts organizations in eastern Massachusetts and more public dollars. And so we thought about how do we get more public dollars in there. We decided to really focus on some grant making for some organizations that were actually, that was their goal, long-term advocacy for public dollars. And so we had to switch our strategy there. When I think about our international program, which is called the Institute for Inclusive Security, that's really around women, peace, and security. And we engage in training of women to make sure that they are, in these areas of violent conflict, that they are ready and that they are engaged in negotiating formal and informal peace processes, in reconstructing, in setting laws for the new governments. And we have a whole team of people in Washington, D.C. who actually train other people to be strong advocates, whether it's at the White House, the State Department, Congress, foreign governments. And so we've taken a very kind of hands-on approach there and are in direct contact with policymakers constantly. So we've kind of figured out how to do that in different ways, and different programs called for different strategies. So can you talk a little bit more about one or two examples of maybe different strategies that you used in your own work?
Sure. So it's somewhat trite, but there's a saying that people are using around my office to use all the tools in the toolkit. And I'll give you an example of a way we did that. So someone earlier mentioned community colleges in a question in the previous talk, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So the foundation, through our program department and through our grant making, had been funding various programs at community colleges in the area for a number of years. We had also been funding workforce development programs. In particular, there was one program that was very interesting on providing career ladder to people working at some of the major hospitals in the area. And in both our work in the community, direct funding of the community colleges, and in this workforce, we were finding that there was sort of a lack of synchronicity among the different community colleges and a lack of communication with employers. And this had been an issue that, if you had been around in Massachusetts politics, had been coming up now and again for a number of years. So with that program work as a guidance, we started setting up some focus groups and interviews with people from the community colleges, from the workforce development systems, from community groups, from educators, for a number of months. And then we worked with some consultants to come up with a report based on the findings of these focus groups, as well as looking at some of the best practices at community colleges across the country. So we then had a large convening. We had this one at the Federal Reserve Bank, where we published the report and released it. We had a speaker from the Chancellor of the Virginia Community College System come up and talk about his system. And we got great coverage in the press on it. But several of the community college presidents were a little bit upset with the report, to say the least. They felt that at the time, the Massachusetts Community College, we had 15 campuses. They all had their own line item in the budget. They had their own boards. They did not report to any sort of central planning. They did not coordinate their course offerings. They did not coordinate their course numbering. So if you're taking chemistry 101 at one campus, it's chemistry 95 at another. You're not using the same material, so an employer can't rely on the training. So we published that report. We had been in talks with the Commissioner of Higher Education and with the Governor's office, and we published the report in the fall, and then in January at the Governor's State of the State address, he made it really the centerpiece of his agenda for that year. So we then convened a lot of the people who we talked to in the focus groups, and we formed a coalition to support the governor's agenda to bring some structural reform to the community college system. And we did that. We did a lot of meetings at the State House. In fact, I think there are 200 state legislators. I think I met with 140 of them in the space of 2 months. And it wasn't just me, because it was very easy for people to dismiss it as saying, this is the Boston Foundation, there's a problem with the Boston College, it doesn't worry the rest of us. But we would set up these meetings and we would bring in our partners who don't have either the experience or the comfort level to go up to the State House, to take a meeting, to make their claim, to offer their support. So if I'm meeting with a legislator from Framingham, it's much more important if I have a student who attends a community college in their district, or an employer who is in their district and is having trouble finding the right type of employee. One of the hinges of this work was, at the time, there were about 120,000 open jobs in the Commonwealth and 200,000 unemployed people. And there was some mismatch problem where people didn't have the skills needed to fill the jobs that were open. So we worked with our partners through those meetings with the legislature, and eventually got legislation passed about 6 months later that now has an entirely different system for the community colleges. The presidents have all come around. We've since had meetings, and we're continuing to support that effort with private funds and research. And we were able, in the space of a year, to make a significant change in higher education, so it will be more, it will serve the students who go to those colleges much better. It will tie them better with transferring to four-year colleges, to finding opportunities in the workplace, and to having a better educational outcome.
We just got the 10-minute cue card.
Okay.
So I want to give you both a chance to answer this question, and then we'll open it up for questions here in the audience. So get your thoughts ready.
Okay, I can be quick. So I gave you the preview of the voter engagement work. You know, one of the things that we did, well, there's a thing in philanthropy that I find interesting. So every good organization tries to make their reputation look the best, right? I mean, can we just be honest, right? We did this, yes. But Access Strategies Fund has realized something. When you look at social change funding, or in our case, democracy funding, there's not one of us who's actually changed the landscape. We did it together. I mean, really, if you think about it, organizations get money from multiple funders and multiple partners. And also, multiple funders tend to give to the same kinds of groups and causes. So really, we have to look at our macro impact and not just singularly what we're doing to make impact, which, by the way, that's for another panel, why I think measuring our impact is really difficult, because we're not honest about that. Some of it is our own foundation impact, and some of it is we're making an impact with others who have resources, and we're moving in the same direction or funding the same things, and we don't know it. But anyway, so that's how we got our work up to scale and made greater impact. We said, let's go and work with other foundations to bring this model of voter engagement to scale. And I just want to talk about, I talked about the personal being important, right? It's really important to have people involved who see this as an issue that has an impact, they understand it. I talked about how this makes large-scale impact when you fund social change. But I also think you have to do it with others, because if you're going to create really big structural changes, you can't do it as one singular foundation. First of all, you need a decent amount of money to make a philanthropic impact. You need really, really interested, excited people who work with foundations or work with donors, who have passion, who have ideas, and you get those people together with the community, and you can really solve a problem. And we saw that this voter engagement problem was something that we could solve. We could get communities participating. So we joined in with a handful of other foundations, and we invested for like a year or two around voter engagement in the city. Well, 8 years later, we are still funding that work, actually 10 years, because what we found is when we invested, and we invested strategically, and we invested together, and we invested for a long period of time with a lot of resources, voila, you have success. And so I'm joking, because many funders, we fund a year and we say that the job is over. It's amazing, if you stick with something and you stick with policy and you do it for a long time, you will see a very, very big result. And so we saw voter increases in our target communities, upwards of 130% change, 50% change. We saw communities like Chinatown, politicians flooding their communities, their forums, trying to be responsive, all over the place. So we saw that if you come together, you can really make impact. Also, you'll learn later that there's all these rules and laws about what foundations can and can't do, but you can do so much, by the way. I'm a lawyer, which comes in handy when other people say, I'm feeling nervous. I go, we can do this. There's a way to do this. And There's a way to fund almost anything that you want and not get into trouble, folks. And what we found is when we experimented and we were bold, we got those strong results. But if you fund in a pack, if you fund together, you spread that liability, you spread that economic security, and you do it together and you learn together. We actually felt more protection together doing this work than we did alone, and frankly, we had better results. So I want to really put in a plug for foundations coming together. We did that with the Boston Foundation, our colleague Chaim's foundation that's here, and many of you, to come together and replicate models of success. So we had success around voter engagement, and we've done the collaborative model on a number of issues. We got communities participating in the 2010 census around redistricting, and now we're going to be doing it around our economic justice and our democracy landscape. So I just want to put in a plug for the role of donor collaboratives.
Thank you. Can you weave your answer into a question's answer? I want to take just a couple of questions because, you know, we tried to advocate for a 3-hour panel because we're so excited. We were not successful. So let's take a couple of questions before we have to end. Yes, please. You have a microphone coming.
Hi, my name is Susanna Reyes. I like that line you used, democracy funding, and I'm wondering with your voter engagement process, how much funding you sought from individuals and how much you sought from grants, and should there be a percentage that you allocate towards grants? Is that helpful, or do you think the democracy individual funding was more impactful for your efforts?
That's such a great question. I would say, you know, honestly, we did it with other community foundations and private foundations because we wanted to maximize the amount of money quickly available. And at the time, there were individual donors involved as well, but not as many. But there's still, I think, great opportunity for individual donors and charitable foundations to come together and do work. The challenge is individual donors are more motivated by what motivates them today. And I think with charitable foundations, there's longevity, and we're kind of in it for the long haul, and there's more accountability in theory because we have boards and staff. So there's sometimes challenges working across individual donors with foundations. I would like to see more of those collaborations, though, a lot more. And I think the nonprofits who do advocacy and fundraising who are most successful, they don't just rely on us as foundations. They have really aggressive individual donor campaigns to bring in money to do their work. And I think it would be better to do it together, but in the voter engagement case, we really only worked primarily with charitable foundations who already had an orientation toward social justice, social change, and working on democracy issues. And each year, as we did our work better and better, and as we did more collaboratives together, we'd add on a new foundation, add on a new individual donor, bring in people. Because my goal in philanthropy is by the time I leave my job is there's going to be more and more people funding this work. So I always look at my success as, did I bring in another funder? Did I bring in another foundation to this work? And did we accomplish more together than we did individually?
Thanks for your question. Is there another one? Jennifer. It's coming.
I'll start with Keith, but any of you please jump in. We see that there's advocacy and there's, as you say, an inclination. Those already in social justice work, those who are already viewed in the lens of philanthropy as perhaps progressive, who are more carefully engaging in advocacy. Have you seen a shift? Has advocacy in the field of philanthropy become a more universally accepted tool, or are there still the perhaps more progressive front runners?
As far as community foundations across the country, I don't have a lot of direct colleagues. So there aren't a lot of community foundations that actually fund a position that has a registered lobbyist working to develop their policy and working to advocate the policy. I do see more engagement. I think in general the field has been more active on very specific things. For example, the charitable tax deduction at the federal level is something that a lot of my colleagues know about, as opposed to in-depth state level work on education policy or something else. So I think you're right. I think there are more progressive front rears, but there are also more conservative advocates too. I think that the comment earlier about they're playing a long game is absolutely accurate, and I think that it's something that that people are starting to realize that they need to be a little bit more active at both the state and federal level, and people are starting to be a little bit more comfortable with it. I would say Massachusetts is a little bit different because we have in 2009 we passed new lobbying laws that are very strong, and a lot of people had to really reevaluate what they were doing and make sure they are in compliance, and something that we have to be very careful of. So I think because of that care we take in the positions here in the state, we're more comfortable with our work than some other sister organizations could be across the country.
And then I can speak a little bit more because I think about half of our funding comes from foundations, and so I think oftentimes when foundations think about advocacy, they think about lobbying, right? And so, but there are multiple strategies that can help influence policy and systems change, and Opportunity Nation is a good example of that. So we had a number of foundations that funded our national summit in 2012, which was an opportunity to engage new champions, engage our coalition, train our leaders and scholars. There was not a sort of direct advocacy focus at that summit, but there was certainly around this idea of educating people about a particular issue. So issue advocacy, but not direct lobbying. And so I think, as foundations think about those multiple strategies to help influence the conditions in which change can take place, there's a whole host of things that they can fund that really would not even have to go through legal compliance.
I would agree there's not enough. I don't think there's enough people doing this work in philanthropy. You all have an opportunity, I hope, if you think about a career in philanthropy, to help. Because if you come in with an orientation for social change and can influence others in the philanthropic organization to invest, they might. They really might, and that's really, really important. I remember I spoke to one leader of a community foundation, and I said, well, why don't you get engaged with policy advocacy or this kind of work? And she was really honest. She said, I've just never been a part of any kind of change like that. I know how to do direct services, charitable work, but I don't know what it means to run an advocacy campaign. So one of the things, we don't do a lot of site visits in our organization. We actually go to the community meetings and participate in them with the community. We don't, get in their way, but we're there. We're holding signs with them. We're engaged. I think we need to get more people in philanthropy to see and feel what this is like, and to have an experience like many of us had and you have had, to see change created like that. If you haven't, then you're going to see it through one model of philanthropy, which is, maybe we deal with one issue at a time or one service at a time. So I think part of our charge to get more people involved in this work is we have to get them on the ground seeing what it's like and being a part of it. And once they see that change, they get energized, they go back, and they share it with their colleagues. And for those of you who've had that experience, I really encourage you to bring it to philanthropy. And if you are working for a funder who you don't think embraces it, but you do, think about the opportunity you can create and try to influence your organization.
Okay, we have several questions that I'm going to ask that you maybe wait until the break and see if you can maybe talk to the panelists at that point. We do need to wrap up in the next 1 minute. So take 15 seconds and leave this group with some comment, some question, some inspirational statement, each of you. No pressure.
Well, I would say it's important to realize that you need to be open to all partnerships with government, with other nonprofits, with local community groups. And one of the other, in terms of being a good advocate, one of the things that I think has helped me, and I think not enough lobbyists and advocates do, is they don't listen. They come in, they have their position paper, they have their talking points, and they try to get it all out to whatever policymaker they're talking to, but they're not listening and reacting to that person's needs, okay, or that person's wants.
I would say just think upstream. It's not enough to just make a difference for one person. You need to think about how to make a difference for everybody.
If you're impatient with injustice and inequities, then let's really open this door wide open and create change together.
Thank you all, and thank you to the audience. And remember, we're still looking for the end to our joke. It must start with a philanthropist, a nonprofit leader, and a policymaker walk into a bar. And it has to be respectful of each of those people. Thank you.